May I just suggest that we try to keep the questions as clear and as concise as possible so that as many people as possible will be able to participate. And I'll start with someone with the question for Professor Davis.
Yes, Dr. Davis, I very much appreciated your time and your viewpoints. I tried as best as I could with both of you gentlemen to take accurate notes. I may have misunderstood you, so I'd just like to ask a two-part question if I could. You had mentioned, I believe, had evolution taken a different route, we would have had different values. Am I saying that correctly? Mm-hmm. Okay, and the other one had to do with the resurrection. You didn't see where the resurrection necessarily fit in with either Jesus' claim to be God or Christianity or that type of value. My question is this. Evolution did take the route it's taken on planet Earth. If we have evolved, the whole human race has evolved, has it not? The whole human race. Well, in some cultures, we love our neighbors. In some cultures, we eat our neighbors. And based upon majority feelings or whatnot, can evolution, I'm asking, explain that?
Yes. I'm not sure what the point is. I would imagine that evolution can't explain it in the sense that evolution is one part of a set of theories that we need to explain complex social institutions, but I would imagine that it plays some role in any such explanation. You need to know something about the history of the society, the sociology of the society, and so forth. What society is it in which people eat one another?
Pardon me?
What society are you referring to in which people
Well,
eat?
from a Christian standpoint of view, parents teach their children to love their neighbors. In a cannibalistic society, parents teach their children to eat their neighbors.
Okay, I wasn't aware I wasn't aware that there was a society in which parents teach their kids to eat the neighbors the way we teach our kids to eat McDonald's hamburgers.
Okay. Well, maybe they're not. The people do in fact get eaten, and I thought, I didn't think it was just something.
We teach our kids to fight wars, in which also severe injury is done to other people. I think we find violence and wrong in various societies. I wasn't aware, however, of a society in which it's a daily occurrence that people eat one another.
Well, I'm taking up too much time, and I apologize for that. The other quick thing was, since Jesus, in his teaching, taught that he was one with God, and he did teach that to a certain group, that the Sadducees who did not believe in the resurrection, he taught that since the God who spoke to Moses said that I am the God of Abraham, I am the God of Jacob, I am the God of Isaac, he said that if he was that God, then they must live, then there must be a resurrection, as Dr. Craig pointed out, maybe not as the Jews understood of Jesus being able to physically come out of a tomb, but nonetheless that life did go on after corporeal existence ended. And since Jesus himself had taught that he was one with the Father, would not the resurrection of him from the grave substantiate that claim?
I don't know if it would substantiate the claim. It would, I guess I have two quick responses. One is that it would seem to bring the claim, it both in a way tends to confirm the claim, and at the same time it tends to undermine the claim, because it tends to give us reason to think that something was going on there that is designed as a confirmation. That he taught these things. He taught that we were one, and not only himself, but that we in some way have a special relationship with God. We would confirm that some event of that has a relationship to his teachings. How should I put this? It would confirm that of a coincidence between his teachings and in the event his resurrection, it would still leave us with questions about the interpretation of those teachings, whether in fact we've got the correct interpretation that he is one with God, that there is a resurrection, and so forth. I'm sorry, that's not terribly clear.
No,
but I'm
thank
feeling
you.
pressed a little bit
And I
by time.
apologize again about the earlier
that's fine.
question. It was just basically, does evolution, again, does it explain the difference between a Mother Teresa and a Charles Manson? Can there be that kind of a diversity, you know, among two people who basically evolve? It just, I wasn't sure
I
what it
feel a little
meant.
bit pressed for time, and I apologize for the unclarity of response to the second question.
I would just say very briefly that at most evolution could explain our subjective apprehension of values, but evolution doesn't do anything to explain the objectivity of values, since if it had taken a different course, there might be an entirely different set of values on the atheistic view. On the theistic view, values exist independently of the course of evolution, and evolution would at best explain how we subjectively come to apprehend the values that do exist.
Now we'll have a question from this gentleman, addressed,
Yes.
I assume, to Dr. Craig.
Yeah. Oh, wow, this is strong. Who created God? Was there still further God that created that God, and on ad infinitum?
No, that would be impossible if you cannot have an infinite regress. You have to come to an absolutely first, uncaused, necessary being, as I said in my speech.
I would agree, but when you look at the two sides, there's no proof that God exists, but there is proof that existence exists, that this world does exist.
Yes, but the problem is that this universe is not an eternal and necessary being. Atheists have typically held that the universe is eternal, and in this way they could say that it needed no cause because it never began to exist. But this is why the discovery of the Big Bang origin of the universe in the finite past out of nothing was such an emotional shock, quite frankly, to many scientists, because it completely undermines the notion that the universe is eternal and uncaused, and points beyond itself to some sort of an eternal, uncaused being which brought it into existence.
I think I could explain the Big Bang Theory. Maybe the universe contracts to a tiny little point, and then it gets to a point where it has to explode again, and that all that radiation that they pick up is just sucked up, and the whole thing starts over and over again.
Yeah, that's called the oscillating model of the universe, and there are at least 3 problems with an oscillating model of the universe. Number one, it's physically impossible. For all the mathematical models that have been drafted of this, there are no known laws of physics which could reverse a contraction and cause the universe to bounce back to a new expansion. According to the laws of physics, an object under gravitational self-collapse will simply not bounce back. It will simply collapse. And therefore, it's physically impossible to have this kind of a model. Secondly, such a model is also observationally untenable, because in order for the universe to recontract, it has to have a certain critical density that will overcome the force of the expansion. And the measurements of the density of the universe presently indicate that the universe would have to be at least 10 times denser than it is in order for the universe to recontract. And finally, number 3, such a model is also thermodynamically impossible. It's been shown that as the universe would oscillate, entropy would build from cycle to cycle, as well as radiation would accumulate, so that such a model would have larger and larger oscillations as time goes on. What this means is such a model could have an infinite future, but it would only have a finite past. In fact, Joseph Silk, in his book, The Big Bang, estimates that even if the universe were oscillating on the basis of current entropy and radiation levels, it could not have gone through more than 100 previous oscillations. And therefore, I think that the oscillating model is widely discredited today as an attempted solution to avoiding the Big Bang singularity. Of course, I couldn't get into this in my opening speech because of time factors. But you're right, there are those suggestions, but I think there are good reasons for rejecting them.
Oh, that's a big lie.
Could I just say a quick point about that? I guess these are impressive facts about the nature of the world, and this gives me the occasion to say something about the eternity of God. The point about the phrasing that for absurdity one has to choose. We are in a position where we don't understand bunches of things. We are then asked to understand that the universe is the product of a certain kind of creation out of nothing by a eternal and timeless being. I don't think it's rhetoric when I say absurdity for absurdity. I don't know if that's in and of itself actually absurd, but it shows the situation is very, very curious and very difficult. That's the choice, I suppose, that you have to make. Either think the world has come into being, assuming present scientific evidence, uniquely, and by the problems that brings, or think that there is an eternal being that thinks without time and makes plans and brings things to pass. It's a difficult choice, but I don't know if one is compelled to it by the finitude of the physical universe.
Dr. Davis, you said about how nihilism is just as probable, well, it sort of sounded like just as probable with a Christian or a theistic viewpoint as it is with an atheistic viewpoint. My understanding of nihilism is just basically nothing means anything, very simplified. Wouldn't the belief of the Christian viewpoint that we derive our value from a God that is eternal and outside of our realm, wouldn't that put value in and therefore make nihilism no longer, an issue from the Christian viewpoint?
I don't think so. I was thinking of nihilism in the sense I thought Dr. Craig was using the term as the view that there's no foundation to moral values. Maybe you could say that's the negative thesis of nihilism. There's no foundation to moral values. Now, if the response is that, well, if you have a God, there is a foundation, then I think the question gets repeated: in what way is then the having of a God a foundation for these values? What you need to know is what makes something a foundation of values. If that, what qualifies something as a foundation for values? If you can appeal to something as a foundation for values, I guess you escape this kind of nihilism. If the Christian appeals to God as a foundation of values, and that makes sense, that God is in a better position with regard to founding values than we or something else is, then fine. But that's the source of my skepticism.
What I would say in response to the question is that Christianity embodies the Platonic tradition of thinking of God as the good with a capital G, and that all moral values, if they exist, are such only because there exists some sort of an absolute standard or yardstick against which they're measured. And that on an atheistic, humanistic view, as Nietzsche saw, there simply is no such standard. It's gone. But in the Platonic Christian tradition, it's found in the good. And the difference between the Christian and Plato, I think, is that the Christian conceives of the good as being the very moral nature of God himself. That God is necessarily loving, just, holy, merciful, etc. And that, as I say, these issue forth then in divine commands that thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, etc., which become for us moral duties. But God himself, in a sense, doesn't have moral duties. He simply acts naturally according to his nature and the way that he is. And the way that he acts naturally become for us moral duties in virtue of his divine commands. So I think that there is a foundation on the Christian view in this concept of the good as the nature of God.
Dr. Craig, I think it's clear to everybody here that whether you're a theist or whether you're an atheist, there are intelligent people on both sides of this argument, but they are both, in fact, plausible, whether you are a theist or an atheist. There are rational arguments for both sides. My question is, are they not, in fact, both religions? We have allowed, as Christians, we have allowed atheists to term us as religious and therefore ban religious teaching from government, and yet we don't use the same label on the atheist. And I think what this debate here proves, and I think Dr. Davis would agree, I'd appreciate to hear his comments also, that atheism is as much a religion as theism. And yet we as Christians do not use that same connotation when we refer to atheists, and we thereby allow the government to force a non-religious, so to speak, teaching on our children and ban theism from the classroom.
Well, one of the things I appreciated about Dr. Davis's opening remarks is that he said very forthrightly that humanism is a religion, and the Humanist Manifesto states that it's a bold new religion for our time. And in fact, although I can't cite it from memory, this has also been declared by the U.S. Supreme Court. There was a ruling in which they ruled that humanism is a religion and therefore falls under the protection of the Constitution concerning religious liberties and so forth. So I think it certainly is true that humanism is a religion, just as much as Christianity is. And if humanists try to deny this, I think they're just being disingenuous. Where I would disagree with you, though, is that I don't think that atheism is as plausible as theism. I mean, I don't see any good reasons to think that atheism is true.
No, I'm sorry.
And I've invited these in other debates that I've had, you know, with atheists. I had a debate, I think it was Tuesday night, with a fellow on atheism versus Christianity. And just constantly, I just don't find the arguments in favor of atheism are very good. And there are some good arguments for theism. I would be willing to concede they're not compelling. But I think that when you weigh the probabilities, theism is certainly on balance more plausible than the alternative.
Yeah, I'm not sure what to say about the question of whether atheism is a religion or not. In any case, we want to separate it from political questions about what rights people have to give expression to beliefs, and whether things like prayer in schools or not is allowing prayer or not allowing prayer in schools is a good idea. I think atheism certainly is a view about religion. And it is a view that some people adopt with fervor. If a view about, for instance, the divine, which is adopted with fervor, is a religious view, then that sort of atheism is a religion. Whether religion or not, the convictions that individuals have are supposed to be protected by our Constitution.
Dr. Davis, I would appreciate it if you would comment on your understanding of the notion of an objective moral truth or value, and whether or not your understanding admits of any such thing or something comparable without God's existence.
What was the last part?
Whether there could possibly be any such thing or something somewhat comparable to an objective moral value without God's existence.
Yeah, let me take the last part. It seems perhaps the important part. I suppose it's a question of how high you set the standards for objectivity. When Dr. Craig thinks of Platonism in relation to Christianity, that there is an objective realm of value. According to Plato, there would be an objective realm of value or value facts of some sort. They wouldn't be in any clear relation, at least, to the more normal kinds of facts, like the facts of biology or the facts of society or the facts of tomorrow's breakfast. They would be, well, Platonic. If that's the standard of objectivity that one is setting, I think there's some problems with that. But I tend not to want to defend the objectivity of moral values in that sense. If one is saying that there are other kinds of facts, and they have a certain hardness to them, people talk about hard facts. There are hard facts about economics, there are hard facts about sociology, there are hard facts about, well, I think, what's good for us and what isn't so good for us. There are hard facts, I think, about love, and there are hard facts about hate. These facts, certainly contingent on the nature of our species and the conditions of our life as they are, but contingent, those are also hard facts. I mean, these things exist. Those facts, I think, give some basis for moral judgment, and those moral judgments have objectivity because they are about objectively existing states of affairs, actions, and persons.
The moral judgments would refer to what is right and what is wrong.
Yes.
Maybe you could clarify for me, please, how or what you see as the connection between these kinds of facts, objective facts that concern our everyday lives, economics, and so on. What is the relation between those facts and what is right and what is wrong?
Yeah, I think one has to make maybe some basic decisions about what one thinks one is talking about when one says things are right or wrong. If what one thinks one is talking about is human welfare and well-being, then there are going to be relations between the conditions under which human beings thrive and flourish and the conditions under which they cannot thrive and flourish. There are going to be relationships between those conditions and judgments about what's right and what's wrong for us to do. Those conditions are to the extent that we can assign them to sciences, subject matters of things like economics and so forth. But of course, not everything is being treated by some academic science either. So right and wrong, it seems to me, is a human affair. And again, I tend to think it would be a human affair even with the existence of God.
Humanists can be very slippery about this notion of objectivity. They'll often say that values aren't subjective in the sense of meaning they're just sort of something you invent in your mind. In that sense, they're not subjective. They're rooted in, as Dr. Davis says, objective facts about conditions under which human beings thrive and flourish. Well, I would certainly agree there are objective facts about the conditions under which human beings thrive and flourish, but those are not moral facts. Those are just facts about sociology or about biology, but those aren't moral facts. Those aren't facts about right and wrong. And therefore, I would resist the notion that there is any sort of objective right and wrong on these views. They appeal to certain objective facts, yes, like that human welfare is not promoted by killing each other. But that does nothing to show that Homo sapiens killing each other off is any more morally wrong than some other animal species which kills itself off. So that, yes, there are objective facts about the conditions under which human beings flourish, but those aren't moral facts on an atheistic worldview.
Now, a question for Dr. Craig?
Yes, Dr.
This will be
Craig.
the last one, okay.
Well, no. We have to allow people who are waiting.
Well, we assigned 20 minutes. The camera crew wanted 2 hours total, so.
Well, I think we should, whether the camera crew records it or not, I think we should allow people to ask their questions. We won't take any more after the folks who are already standing. And now a question for Dr. Craig.
Dr. Craig, I wonder if you're being possibly Pharisaical in reasoning about the validity of your faith. There's nothing in Christian teaching that I'm aware of that holds human rationality and reason to be a kind of exalted sense for determining the truth of things. In fact, there are passages in the Bible that suggest the opposite, that in fact rationality and reason can be deceptive and that they work against faith. Part of what concerns me about this too is that I wonder, sometimes people are attracted to rationality because it is singular and compelling. There is one reason. If what is reasonable for me has to be reasonable for you. Whereas in faith, there is a kind of, it's a personal gift that one embraces. And I think in embracing that, you also give permission to other people to embrace a faith that is also personal to them.
Yes.
As the scripture says, in my Father's house, there are many mansions. And I think that's very important. And I wonder if in giving so much credit to rationality and to reason, you're not, in some subtle way, playing into a essentially secular humanist approach to the issue of truth.
Yes. Well, this is a very good consideration. I think a very important issue to raise. I don't think that the Bible in any way depreciates human reason or rationality as such. It does warn us in places that human reason can be twisted and used in wrong ways, but I think we would all agree with that. But as an instrument, as a faculty, if you will, I don't find anywhere in Scripture that reason is denounced. It denounces things like worldly wisdom, that is reason when it is perverted to wrong uses, but not reason as such. And on the contrary, I would say that the approach that I've used tonight would be sanctioned by the Christian doctrine of general revelation. That is to say that God has left, so to speak, his fingerprints in the clay, in creation, so that we can infer the existence of the designer and the creator by the imprints left in his handiwork. And in Paul's letter to the Roman church in chapter 1, he says, from the creation alone and from the moral law written in our hearts, we can know that there is a God who exists. And so I do think that the use of arguments and evidence for the existence of God is a valid use and legitimate. Well, what role does that leave for faith to play? Well, I think that faith is often misunderstood as something that sort of makes up for a lack in reason, that reason takes you so far and then you leap the rest of the way in faith. And I think that's a misunderstanding myself. As I understand faith in the New Testament, faith is not something that makes up for a lack of reason. Rather, faith is placing your trust or your confidence in something that you hold to be true. It's like when you get married and you and your betrothed come to the altar. You're not you're not putting your faith in her existence. What you're doing there is you're making a commitment to her. You're pledging your allegiance and your life and love to her. That's what faith is like when one puts faith in God. You can know God exists without really having faith in him. And so I think this is the proper understanding of faith. And when we understand it that way, we see it's not at all contrary to or inimical to reason. Rather, faith is a wholly different movement, parallel to reason, a movement of trust and love and commitment in that which you know to be true.
A quick follow-up, if you will. In Job, it's very clear that human beings aren't to judge God, that our relationship to God is one of transcendence, and try to measure him or the way he works in human terms. And if you approach the world that way, I don't think you could reason then about first cause. It doesn't make sense to me that we think of God essentially as the cause of existence. We're measuring him by our own limited rationality. And I think it's a very important point to consider too, my point that there are many faiths, that Christianity is not the only faith, the only path that may lead one to some form of revelation, and that if one has experienced that within a Christian context, what would be your evidence that one cannot experience that within a Buddhist context or a Hindu context or any other kinds of faith?
With respect to religious pluralism, I certainly wouldn't deny that there are elements of truth in all religions. But I do think that the truth is fully and decisively revealed in Jesus. This is what he claimed. And you can't hold, for example, that what Jesus taught is true and then what the Buddha taught is true, because they're utterly contradictory to each other. And therefore we have, as we look at the faiths and philosophies of the world, to ask ourselves, which one of these, if any of them, is the truth? And I'm convinced, on the basis of my own religious experience, as well as the arguments that I've given tonight, that in fact God has decisively revealed himself in Jesus, and that salvation and reconciliation to God comes through him.
Gentlemen? Yes, Dr. Davis, and I'd also be glad for Dr. Craig's response also, if he cares to give one. On this may be somewhat limited in people who know of the philosopher, mathematician Alfred North Whitehead, but I wonder if you'd be able to give a very brief critique of the process philosophy, if you're at all familiar with that.
Not terribly.
You're not too?
Not terribly familiar with it, no.
Some familiarity.
A little bit, yeah.
As I understand, I mean, he gives some modified form of the cosmological argument for the existence of God, and that the universe is in constant process, and that any event that occurs has some effect on every other event that occurs. As a brief, shall I say, very brief summary of what I understand. And so therefore, the idea is that, well, if you grant that everything must have a sufficient reason, this is a cosmological argument. No. Okay. If you grant that everything must have a sufficient reason for it, the universe itself must have a sufficient reason. The only sufficient reason would be God. This is not quite the argument that Whitehead gives, but it's in some modified and perhaps simplified form. I wonder if you want to be able to comment on that.
I don't want to try to comment on Whitehead and process theology, but apparently the way you phrased the question, one doesn't really have to talk about Whitehead and process theology. One has to talk about this notion of sufficient reason, right?
Okay, yeah.
And the force, I suppose, of the point is that what we've got is a world which, like any other thing or set of things, has to have a sufficient reason for existing, according to this principle. And I would make the following comment about that. It's not clear what kind of principle the principle of sufficient reason is supposed to be, or whether we've got sufficient reason for that principle. It's not clear what kind of principle it's supposed to be. Is it a principle of inquiry, according to which we are directed always to search for causes, and when we get plausible candidates for causes, we're to sift through them and figure out what is the best cause. If it's a principle of inquiry, then it leaves open the question whether we do in fact find sufficient causes. Usually people are more interested in treating it as a kind of ontological principle, I guess, a principle about the nature of reality. Reality has got to have such causes in it. Why? I don't know exactly. That's the point of the joke about the sufficient reason for this principle. But again, if reality has got to have sufficient cause in it for its existence, what would a sufficient cause look like? Again, my point about the divine is that God is often alluded to as being the cause sufficient for explaining other things, for explaining creatures. But the question about the firstness of God, the first causiness of God, is taken to be answered, I suppose, by virtue of the fact that it's God that we're speaking of. I feel that there is a breach of the principle. If you take it seriously, you take it seriously all the way. There has to be some cause of God. Or if you don't take it that seriously, then of course you can stop at the existence of God. But then you could have stopped at numerous other places. I suppose my fundamental feeling about it is that the world and God make a contingent set. Just as Leibniz wondered that there are things rather than nothing. It's a weird consideration that there could have been nothing. Dr. Craig argues there once was nothing. So too, I think one has to wonder that there is a God. I take it there could have been nothing.
Thank you.
Just very briefly, I didn't claim that once there was nothing, because I think that God always existed timelessly, so that what I would say is that Leibniz correctly saw that this principle requires you to get back to a metaphysically necessary being who carries the reason for his own existence within his essential nature. And that necessary being is either God or the material universe. And the fact that the universe began to exist shows that the universe is not a metaphysically necessary being. It's contingent, and that therefore it must have been brought into being by a metaphysically necessary being, which, as I said, would have to be timeless, uncaused, immaterial, and absolutely first. And this is very much the essential core of what theists mean by God.
Thank you.
Yes.
From your discussion, I got an impression or got the perception that you believe that your God is the God, and it's the pillar of morality.
Well,
my question,
I don't think of God as my God.
I'm just saying your way of thinking about it. My question is, why is the God for a man coming from Papua New Guinea who cannot perceive the God, your God, the same way as you have perceived, or a man coming from Saudi Arabia who has no chance of perceiving your God the way you feel it, is not the right God for him? Maybe it is for you, your God, right? And for him, it's his God. That's my first comment. And second comment, just want to say, there is a difference between the Hindu morality and the Hindu practice. It's the same way as the Christian morality and the Christian practice. During the evolution of mankind, every religion has shown a certain heinous crime which has been committed in the name of religion. The Hinduism is the same, and the Christianity is the same. And we don't have to go further. Even in this century, the certain churches have accepted certain type of beliefs, which was, you are 100% certain that you will say that it is not correct.
Right. Yeah.
So my question is, why is your way of thinking is the only way of thinking, and not the other person's way of thinking is not the right person, when he has the same moral attitude, principles as probably you have, or 99% of the people who are in this hall have it?
All right. Let me deal with those questions in reverse order as briefly as I can. I was not attacking Hinduism or the Hindu practice or anything of this sort. What I was simply using was an illustration of a value that we would not hold to, but which was held to in that society. And I could have easily used an example from Western society. My point was simply that if there is no God, there are no objective moral values. And I could have used the Spanish Inquisition or the Crusades as examples of atrocity perpetrated in the name of religion that we would all want to condemn as morally wrong. But if there is no God, then it's impossible to condemn the Crusades or the Inquisition as objectively morally wrong. That was just the socio-cultural byproduct of that day and age. And therefore, on the atheistic view, all of these religious atrocities really are morally acceptable, which I find absurd. Now, with respect to the first question, again, I want to resist this characterization of God as being my God. I mean, I think of myself as his, you know, not the other way around. But what I would argue there is that, again, religious pluralism sounds so nice, it sounds so politically correct, but it's logically impossible. They can't all be true because they're mutually contradictory. The Buddhist concept of God is radically different from the Islamic concept of God. And so they cannot all be true. And in fact, the religious pluralist really does a disservice to the world's religions, because really the religious pluralist looks at them all and say, you're all really believing the same thing. And he denies the distinctives. The religions of the world reject this religious pluralism that tries to melt them all down into this sort of common amalgam. Now, why then do I think that the view that I've defended tonight is correct? Well, on the basis of the arguments that I've given. If those arguments are correct, then there does exist a personal creator and designer of the universe. And all of the world's great monotheistic religions hold to such, whether that be Judaism, Christianity, Islam, or deism, hold to such a conception of a designer and creator of the universe. Now, you ask, but what about the man born in New Guinea who doesn't have a chance to believe in this God? This is a theological question that's dealt with in the New Testament. And there, the Apostle Paul says that all persons, no matter where they're born on earth, can know at least that there is a God who created the universe on the basis of his handiwork in nature, and that there is a moral lawgiver to whom we are responsible for right and wrong. And Paul clearly says that those people who respond to the light that they do have will be judged on the basis of that standard. God is fair and loving, and he's not going to judge them on the same standard that he's going to judge others. He judges people on the basis of their response to the light that they have. And I think that's eminently fair and just of God.
So in that sense, you feel that those who are not Christians are inherently inferior. Is it true? Am I correct to assume that? No, I don't think that they're inferior. By the way, I'm not a Hindu, but by the way.
We'll have our last question from this gentleman,
Yes,
please.
I'll try to be as brief as possible. Dr. Craig, I was very favorably impressed by both your presentation and Dr. Davis's presentations and arguments. But as someone who works in mathematics, I'm a mathematician, I was a little bit discomforted by your notion of infinity, which I find rather, shall I say, not completely informed.
Right. This is a great question to end the evening on.
And secondly, your concept of time. Now, these are critical issues, actually, and I think that someone had to address them. For example, your question of using infinity minus infinity, all right, is different than the way in which you talk about infinity in other ways. For example, for a mathematician, infinity minus infinity refers to an indeterminate form, and that's a term for something that cannot be given a definite value because you can prove that any value could satisfy it. That's the reason why infinity minus infinity is considered undefined. Infinity in that sense simply means that you are talking about a variable that is growing in value without bound. That's all it means. So you have a positive infinity because that quantity is growing through the positive numbers. If you have a quantity that's growing farther and farther away from zero in the negative direction, then you're talking about negative infinity. The point is that the absurdity there is that you cannot coherently define an operation if you were to affix Positive infinity and negative infinity is numbers. They have an order theoretic sense, but they don't have an arithmetic sense. That's the problem with that one. That's a different sense than talking about infinity if you're talking about an infinite set. And an infinite set for a mathematician essentially is a set that you can make in one-to-one correspondence with a proper subset of itself. But I'll take from Amazing Grace, the 5th verse that says exactly what infinity is. It says, when we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. And that is the best definition of an infinite set that I've heard from anyone, whether a mathematician or not a mathematician.
Yes.
And John Newton wrote that.
Yes.
So, okay, so, but my question to you essentially is, what is your actual concept of, very briefly, what is your actual concept of infinity and what is your actual concept of time?
Okay, I told you this was going to be a good one. I knew it. Obviously, in a brief speech like I gave tonight, for someone who's in the profession, it's going to sound incomplete and superficial. But I can only encourage you to read my published works on this. I'm fully abreast of Cantorian set theory and the use of potential versus actual infinity. And the infinity of which I speak is not the indeterminate infinity of which you spoke a few moments ago, that infinity of growing without bound. Rather, I'm speaking of actual infinites, such as play a role in Cantorian infinite set theory. And
cardinality.
Yes, that's right. And with respect to the infinity minus infinity, I'm talking there about using inverse arithmetic operations with transfinite numbers. This cannot be done. You can only use the positive operations of multiplication and addition. You can't use division and subtraction, or you get self-contradictions. And when in the hymn it talks about we've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun, I think that that is referring to precisely the potential infinity of the future, the growing toward infinity as a limit, so that in fact you never arrive at infinity. It's merely a limit at which you never arrive, and in that sense you've no less days to sing God's praise. That type of infinity is purely potential. It's not an actual infinity. And so on that note, I think we can close the debate.
And I thank you very much for your response, and I can definitely declare that I look forward to praising for that long a time, just as you do. Amen.